So it's a pleasure to be able to chair this first session of this afternoon, and first role is to introduce the first speaker, who actually needs no introduction at all. I doubt there's a single person in this room who doesn't know Professor Mann, who has been at the forefront of diabetes, nutrition, cardiovascular disease, both from a research and a clinical perspective for the whole time I've been both a medical student and practicing, and well before that. So it's a pleasure and privilege to introduce Jim to start us off.
Ena mana, ena reo, rauranga tirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Kua mohiu tātou, ki ngā mate hira no atu, I roto I te mate huka. Kua karangatia tēnei ope, kia hui, ki te whakanui nā kotahi rau o te taiaki huka. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. The minister has stolen much of my thunder, so I will just be ad-libbing because he said a lot of the things I was going to say. But it is my privilege today, on behalf of Diabetes New Zealand, the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre, Healthier Lives National Science Challenge, and Lions International District 202F, to welcome everyone present, as well as those online who've joined by live stream. And I think there could be as many as 150 people out there, so you are equally welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge and say how much we appreciate Sir Bruce Robertson being here. He is as chair of the advisory board of the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre, Ms. Kath Taylor, chair of the Diabetes New Zealand board, and Pam Fivash and Wendy Goodwin, who are national coordinators for Lions International, who have made an enormous contribution to diabetes worldwide, actually. So thank you to all of you. I've been asked to record the apologies of Tajeri Mataparai, who is chair of the governance group Kahui Māori of the Science Challenge, and Professor Rachel Taylor, who is director of the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre. They both are very sorry not to be here today. Diabetes has been around for a very long time, and I guess that most people here know that they're symptoms describing a condition which must have been diabetes as long ago as in the literature of Sanskrit and other ancient languages, many, many years BC. It first gained the name, as some of you may know, of diabetes, or at least the Greek version of diabetes. I think it was in the 1st century AD, but pretty early on. And then diabetes mellitus, which acknowledged the sweetness of the urine, in the very beginning of the 17th century. It's much less certain when the two major types of diabetes were recognized, but there are very clear descriptions of what we now know to be type 1 and type 2 in the German literature in the 1800s. And if you haven't read those descriptions of diabetes, it's worth reading, because they were absolutely accurate descriptions of type 1 and type 2. I would like to have done that today, but I was told there wasn't enough time. So I won't do that. I obey orders. It was only in the late 19th century that the role of pancreas was identified, after Minkowski and von Mering reported that dogs whose pancreases were removed developed the classical features of diabetes, and as recently as 1909, that a Belgian scientist conceived the idea that a substance to do with the pancreas might be responsible for blood glucose control. But it is really never ceases to amaze me how quickly things moved after that, despite all the disruptions associated with World War I, which must have disrupted everything in the world, including scientific research. Because in the following 10 years after the Belgian scientist came up with his idea, a pancreatic extract was shown to enable the survival of pancreatectomized dogs. Insulin was extracted and was available for the treatment in Toronto of 14-year-old Leonard Thompson, who was at death's door when he became the first person in the world to be treated with insulin in January 1922, exactly 100, well, not exactly 100 years ago, but just fractionally over 100 years ago. We actually celebrated the centenary of the discovery of insulin last year, but it seemed very appropriate to commemorate the 100 years of insulin treatment this year, especially as there is now evidence that the first person in New Zealand to be treated with insulin received it in the same year as Leonard Thompson in Toronto. It was always generally accepted, in fact, this is what I was taught, that Isabel Stitch was the first person to be treated with insulin in Dunedin, of course, by Dr. later Sir Charles Burns, and in 1923. But in fact, it was drawn to attention not all that long ago that the honor really belongs to a young man called Jake Cato, whose life was saved before hers by a remarkable coincidence. And I think it's a fantastic story, which I will just share with you briefly. This boy, Jake, developed diabetes while he was a boarder at Wanganui Collegiate School in 1918. And he was sent home to Napier and treated with the only treatment that was then available, which was a diet which included almost no carbohydrate. So he was under the care of his family and a GP, a doctor called Thomas Johnson, who was soon to go off on his OE to the UK for further study. And while this guy, Dr. Johnson, was there, he heard about this miracle treatment which had just arrived in London very soon after it was used in Toronto and developed in the United States for clinical use. And he realized that this miracle drug had the potential to save the life of his patient back in Napier. He managed to get hold of a supply, which he got back to New Zealand because Jake's father happened to be the manager of the New Zealand steamship company. And extraordinary. If you just think of how did this news get across? Wouldn't it be wonderful to know how all this happened? And these vials of insulin were handed over to the captain of one of the company's steamships, which despite the long sea journey, I mean, how did they know how to store insulin? I don't know what they knew. It came via South Africa, apparently, on this ship. So it must have taken a heck of a long time, and arrived in Napier in time to save this boy's life. And it's interesting because there are lots of comparable stories. I'd love to tell you them, but I'd probably be, see Cherie looking at me and telling me I've probably gone on long enough already. But there are lots of comparable stories from other countries, and probably from New Zealand too. But the point that I want to make is that unsurprisingly, many of those who were treated with insulin in those early days came from privileged families. This boy happened to have a father who ran the New Zealand Steamship Company. So he and others like him were able to get access to the treatment because they or their families could afford it. Now, mercifully, in Aotearoa New Zealand now, insulin is available to everyone who needs it. But this is not necessarily the case for all those who would benefit from some of the new technologies. And one of the really key themes of today's forum is to draw attention to what is needed to ensure equity of the health outcomes which can be expected from the advanced technology. And I think we're all very excited to hear more about these technologies. Obviously, there's nobody around who can personally testify what it was like to experience insulin treatment in the 1920s. I've been privileged to prescribe insulin for half the time that it's been available, so you can work out roughly what my age is. So I can recall the days when it was drawn up into quite large glass syringes, which had to be boiled to be sterilized, which was often carried around in containers with methylated spirits, which I remember once having a patient of mine that I was traveling with spill this container, and the methylated spirits went all over the train we were traveling in, or the compartment we were traveling in. It was injected via fairly longish metal needles, which also had to be sterilized, repeatedly reused, became blunt, and had to be sharpened. I mean, it is unbelievable. Blood glucose measurements, of course, could only be made from venous blood sent to the laboratory, and the only way someone with diabetes could have any idea as to whether their diabetes was remotely well controlled was by boiling up urine with chemicals. It was almost impossible to tailor injected insulin to requirements in those days. It was a pretty hit and miss business. Today, we are very privileged to hear from someone who has personally experienced insulin treatment for far longer than I've known it, for over 60 years, and I think we all look forward, Neil, to hearing what you have to tell us shortly. We'll also hear from Damien Wiseman, who is an elite sports person, a scientist and a coach with a key role in Paralympic sport, about what can be achieved with new technologies and newest insulins in that particular context. And we're very delighted to have you here, Damon. He and I have known each other for a wee while. But it's equally important that we've got people and families living with diabetes here, and thank you very much for coming here to share with us today. And my colleagues Ryan Paul and Ben Wheeler, who have personal experience in researching the new technologies, supporting patients, and are aware of problems of obtaining access. Ryan will also be talking about the role of insulin in type 2 diabetes, which is a relatively new innovation. And I remember when I first went to Dunedin 35 years ago, and I was seeing patients who, with type 2 diabetes who needed insulin. Some of the medical profession, some of the GPs in the town thought I'd gone completely mad because you didn't actually prescribe diabetes for type 2, insulin for type 2 diabetes. That was only 35 years ago. We're very privileged to have two guests from Australia. Jenny Cooper, who will provide us with the latest thinking regarding the early origins of type 1, and Renzo Scabilia, who will share with us the Australian experience by which funding for new technologies was achieved. And I think a very fitting end to the day will be the awarding of the New Zealand Awards at the end of the afternoon. So we look forward to that too. So before I conclude and hand over back to Jeremy to continue with the important part of today's presentations, I really want to thank everybody who's agreed to be involved in this celebration. Tutua and Minister Clark, who have now left for doing what they did for us today, for everybody who will present, for everyone who's present, whether online or here, and also those people who have worked behind the scenes to make the day possible. There's Cherie Stainer, Rosie Jackson, Heather Very, Marsha Mackey, and the whole Diabetes New Zealand team who've done an enormous amount of work. And finally, also a very special thank you to somebody who's not here, Dr. Bob Smith, a retired physician, who has prescribed insulin for actually quite a lot longer than I prescribed insulin. And he would like to have been here today to have provided a more detailed history than I have done. He sends his apologies and has provided a written description of some of his thoughts and experiences of helping people with diabetes to manage their condition over a very long period of time. And his story is on that poster board at the back. And I think there are also copies available for anybody who would like to take them home and read about them later. So without further ado, Jeremy, it's over to you to introduce the speakers of the next session. Thank you.